This teeny tiny thing? Hold on a second. This teeny tiny thing, that's 16mm film. It's the format that helped launch the careers of many filmmakers, including Christopher Nolan, Ryan Coogler, and Peter Jackson. And this is 35mm film, the most widely used film format in the movie industry. What exactly is the difference between them? If you're new here, my name's Callum and I make content about film technology and history. If that interests you, consider subscribing. In this video, I'm going to take a look at 16mm film and 35mm. By the end, we'll know some of their histories and differences. Now, let's get started. First, we'll take a look at 16mm. It's 16mm across, with the image being approximately 10.3mm in width and 7.5mm in height. It has an aspect ratio of 1.37 to 1. This means that the width is 1.37 times the height. This version of 16mm is single perforation. Perforation refers to the sprocket holes used to move the footage through a camera or projector. They're located on one side, while a soundtrack is on the other. Double perf 16mm would have another set of perforations where the audio is here. There is also another version of 16mm called Super 16. With this format, instead of more sound or more sprocket holes, the image would be wider. This allows for the creation of a picture with an aspect ratio of 1.66 to 1. 16mm film was first introduced in 1923 by Eastman Kodak as a budget-friendly version of 35mm. At the time, it was considered substandard by the motion picture industry. But in the 1930s, it began to make some progress in the educational market, and it was also heavily used to document World War II. With the introduction of television in the 1950s, the format began to see even more professional use, with the BBC in particular pushing the format. This is because they needed a high-quality, yet cheaper and more portable form of production. Documentaries also tended to favor 16mm for the same reasons. Eventually, it did start to become more accepted in Hollywood, being used on independent and low-budget productions. Some recent films shot on 16mm include Black Swan, Moonrise Kingdom, and 2025's The Smashing Machine. Next, we'll take a look at 35mm film. It's 35mm across, and normally the image would be approximately 22mm in width and 16mm in height, giving an aspect ratio of 1.37 to 1, and leaving space along the side for a soundtrack here. Both sides of the film also contain perforations. This version of 35mm, however, is an anamorphic print. This means an image with a 2.35 by 1 aspect ratio has been squeezed horizontally onto the frame. This picture also takes up more space vertically, approximately 19mm instead of 16. Most movies like this are shot with an anamorphic lens. This squeezes the image onto the film, and then is used to stretch it back out during projection. 35mm also comes in a super variation, except this time instead of removing perforations, it removes the soundtrack to create a larger image. This would be the same 1.33 to 1 frame that was used during the silent era of filmmaking. Typically, movies shot on Super 35 would be matted. Matting refers to the addition of black bars at the top and bottom of the picture to change the aspect ratio. This could be to 1.85 to 1 or 2.35 to 1. If it was the latter, the matted areas would typically be cropped and the image squeezed onto regular 35mm film. This would then be projected with an anamorphic lens to stretch it back out, just like in this case with this frame from The Matrix Reloaded. 35mm can also come in 3perf and 2perf variations. These give the image a shorter height, but also a wider aspect ratio. This format is pretty much as old as the movie industry itself. It became the standard in the early 1900s because of this guy, Thomas Edison. He owned a majority of the United States patents on motion picture cameras. A few other companies approached Edison and negotiated a licensing agreement, forming the Motion Picture Patents Company, also known as the Edison Trust. Together, they controlled most of the film industry in the United States. Because of this, the film format chosen by Edison became the standard, which was 35mm. Since it was the most widely used format, it was also easier to access and much cheaper than others. By the time a court ruling broke apart the trust in 1915, 35mm had already established itself as the movie standard. This was backed up in 1917 when the newly established Society of Motion Picture Engineers acknowledged the de facto status of 35mm as the industry's dominant film gauge. This continued on into the 1950s, when other formats began to arrive on the scene, including the return of the popular 70mm. These different types of film were used to try and get people away from their televisions and back into the cinema. And it worked. However, formats like 70mm were expensive, so they were usually reserved for large-scale productions. Because of this, 35mm continued to be used on most movies. This dominance extended into the 2010s, where digital cameras eventually took over. Some recent films shot on 35mm include Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, Anora, and Nosferatu. Now let's see how these two formats compare to each other. As you can see, 35mm is larger. In fact, it's a little more than double the size of 16mm. This greater size creates a cleaner and sharper image. Now there are some other things that can affect this, but one of the biggest factors in creating a high quality image is a larger negative. This is because film isn't made up of pixels like digital. Instead, it's made up of a random grain structure. When both formats are shown on the same size screen, 16mm will appear to have larger grain. This is because of the increased magnification that is required. Now, the grainier image produced by 16mm isn't necessarily a bad thing. It depends on the story that is being told. For instance, The Walking Dead was shot on Super 16, and this helped give the show its distinct grungy look. Another difference between them is that 35mm has a wider field of view compared to 16mm. What this means is that if both formats are being shot at the same focal length, this one produces a wider picture. This is because its larger physical size captures more of the lens's imaging circle. Both of these formats are amazing tools for filmmakers to use, and they each have their place depending on the story that is being told. If you enjoyed this video, consider checking out this one here. In it, I compare two different popular 70mm formats. Thanks for watching.